They were surrounded by endless seawater, useless, undrinkable, deadly. Yet pirates found ways to transform it into something so valuable, entire islands became battlegrounds. But how did they pull it off? With no machines, no labs, and barely any fuel. The Caribbean sun blazed down mercilessly on shallow ponds filled with seawater, turning each one into a natural salt factory. Pirates figured out early that Mother Nature could do most of the heavy lifting when it came to making this precious white gold. Why break your back when the sun could do the work for free? These weren't fancy operations either. Pirates would find low-lying areas near the coast or dig out crude basins themselves. Then, they'd flood these makeshift ponds with seawater and let the tropical heat work its magic. The process was brutally simple, but devastatingly effective. Here's where it gets interesting, though. The warm Caribbean climate made this method lightning fast compared to northern regions. While European salt makers might wait weeks for decent results, pirates could harvest salt in just days. The relentless sun and steady trade winds created perfect evaporation conditions year-round. Workers would check their ponds regularly, watching as the water level dropped and mysterious white crystals began forming on the muddy bottom. Salt doesn't just disappear into thin air when water evaporates, it stays behind, building up layer by layer like nature's own treasure chest. The real payoff came when they finally drained the remaining brine and scraped up that crusty salt layer. Makes sense, right? All that seawater had to leave something behind. Pirates used whatever tools they could find, broken swords, pieces of wood, even their bare hands when desperate. But here's the crazy part about these sun-baked operations. Some well-managed ponds could produce salt layers up to 8 inches thick each season. That's serious money sitting there, gleaming white under the tropical sun. 8 inches might not sound like much, but spread across a decent-sized pond, you're talking about tons of salt. The beauty of this method was its reliability. Rain could mess things up temporarily, but the Caribbean's dry seasons were predictably long and brutal. Pirates could count on those blazing months to deliver consistent harvests. Smart crews would set up multiple ponds, staggering their flooding schedules to ensure steady production. Storage became the next challenge once they'd scraped up their crystalline fortune. Salt needed protection from moisture and thieves alike. Well, pirates had creative solutions for both problems, but keeping their hard-won salt dry required some clever tricks that went way beyond simple sun evaporation. The pond method worked great when you had time and decent weather, but what happened when pirates needed salt fast and couldn't wait for perfect conditions? When sun-baked salt pans weren't practical, pirates turned to something even simpler. Got a beach? Got some sand? You're halfway to making salt. The sand evaporation method was brilliantly straightforward. Pirates would soak regular beach sand with fresh seawater, then rake it out in thin layers under the blazing Caribbean sun. The key was spreading it wide and flat so the water could evaporate faster. Think of it like making the world's saltiest sandbox. But here's where it gets clever. They didn't stop after one round. Once that first layer dried out, they'd soak the same sand again with more seawater. Then dry it again and again. Each cycle packed more salt crystals into those tiny grains until the sand became absolutely loaded with the stuff. After several rounds of this soaking and drying dance, pirates had themselves some seriously salty sand. The grains were practically crusted with salt crystals. Now came the washing step, which sounds backward but made perfect sense. They'd shovel up all that salt-packed sand and wash it with just a small amount of clean water. Not enough to rinse the salt away, mind you, just enough to dissolve it off the sand grains. What they got was an incredibly strong, concentrated brine that was ready for the next step in their salt-making process. This method was absolutely perfect for pirate life. No fancy equipment needed, no permanent structures to build, just sand, seawater, and patience. Pirates could set up these makeshift salt operations on any beach or temporary camp near the coast. The beauty of sand evaporation was its flexibility. Weather looking questionable, you could cover the sand with canvas or move it under shelter. Need to move locations quickly? Pack up the tools and find another beach. Traditional salt pans took weeks to establish, but this method could start producing results in days. Some pirate crews got so good at this technique they could judge exactly how many soaking cycles their sand needed just by looking at the crystal buildup. Too few cycles meant weak brine that wasted fuel during boiling. Too many cycles meant diminishing returns and wasted time. The concentrated brine they created was often stronger than what came from natural salt pans. That meant less fuel needed for the final boiling stage. A huge advantage when you're operating with limited resources on remote islands. But speaking of boiling, that next step required some serious heat and the right equipment to handle all that concentrated salt water. When the Caribbean sun disappeared behind storm clouds or the rainy season hit, pirates couldn't just sit around waiting for their salt ponds to cooperate. They needed a backup plan that worked rain or shine. Enter the iron pan method, basically turning seawater into salt the hard way, with fire and a whole lot of patience. The setup was straightforward enough. Wide, shallow iron pans got placed over roaring wood or coal fires. Then came the waiting game. Seawater went into those pans and started its slow transformation from liquid to precious white crystals. The fire did what the sun usually handled. It forced water to flee as steam, leaving behind everything else. But here's where things got tricky. This wasn't some set-it-and-forget-it operation. Skilled operators had to babysit those pans like their lives depended on it. Too little heat. The water barely budges and you waste fuel. Too much heat. The salt burns and turns bitter, ruining the whole batch. The timing had to be absolutely perfect. Pirates who mastered this technique could pull off some impressive numbers. A large iron pan, fed with enough coal, could churn out roughly 1 ton of usable salt. The fuel cost? About 1,600 to 1,800 weight of coal per ton. Not cheap, but when you're stuck on some godforsaken island during hurricane season, expensive salt beats no salt every time. The real beauty of this method was its reliability. Weather didn't matter anymore. Rain could pour down for weeks, but those fires kept burning and those pans kept producing. Pirates operating in the stormier parts of the Caribbean learned to love their iron pans more than their sun-baked salt ponds. Then there's the fuel situation. Wood worked fine when you could find it, but coal burned hotter and more consistently. Smart pirate crews would stock up on coal whenever they raided merchant ships or hit port towns. Some even made special trips just to secure fuel supplies. The process left behind one major headache, though. All that leftover brine packed with bitter minerals that nobody wanted. Dealing with this waste became its own challenge, especially when you're trying to work fast and stay hidden from naval patrols. Speaking of challenges, pirates had to figure out whether their seawater was even worth boiling in the first place. Weak brine meant wasted fuel and wasted time. Fortunately, they developed a dead simple trick to test brine's strength before firing up those expensive coal burns. Pirates weren't exactly known for carrying around fancy scientific instruments, but they had one surprisingly simple trick for testing whether their seawater was salty enough to bother boiling. They grabbed a fresh chicken egg. The logic was beautifully straightforward. Drop an egg into regular seawater and it sinks like a stone. But toss that same egg into brine that's packed with salt, it floats right to the surface like a tiny white cork. The saltier the water, the better that egg floats. Well, here's the science behind this old maritime wisdom. Salt makes water denser and heavier. When you've got enough salt dissolved in your brine, it becomes thick enough to support the weight of an eggshell. Pirates discovered that if their egg floated nicely, they had roughly 4 times the salt content of regular ocean water. That meant serious salt production potential. But why did this matter so much? Boiling seawater takes hours of precious fuel, whether you're burning wood, coal, or whatever driftwood you scrape together. Starting with weak, barely salty water meant you'd waste most of your fire just getting rid of regular water before any real salt formation began. Makes sense, right? The egg test saved pirates from this costly mistake. No floating egg meant the brine wasn't concentrated enough yet. They'd continue the sun evaporation process or add more salt-crusted sand to boost the strength before lighting their fires. Then there's the practical beauty of this method. Eggs were common ship provisions that lasted weeks without spoiling. Every pirate crew had them on hand. No need for specialized measuring tools or complex calculations that half the crew couldn't read anyway. And the weird part is how accurate this simple test actually was. Modern salt makers still use similar floating tests, though they've swapped eggs for hydrometers and other fancy gadgets. Those old sea dogs stumbled onto legitimate chemistry with nothing but breakfast ingredients. The egg trick worked perfectly for the small batch salt, making that pirate crew's preferred. They weren't running massive commercial operations that needed precise measurements. They wanted quick, reliable results that helped them produce enough salt for food preservation and trade without burning through their entire fuel supply. Let's not forget that time was always crucial for pirates. They needed to work fast, stay mobile, and avoid drawing attention from naval patrols or rival crews. This simple egg test kept them efficient and profitable, but even the strongest brine was useless without proper fuel to boil it down. When the supply chains broke down and pirates found themselves stranded on godforsaken islands with nothing but seawater and whatever the ocean coughed up, they got creative. Really creative. Driftwood became their lifeline. Broken masts from wrecked ships, weathered planks that had floated for months, even entire hulls that had run aground. Everything went into the fire. The flames weren't pretty or controlled like those fancy coal fires back in civilization, but they burned hot enough to get the job done. Pirates would scavenge clay dishes from abandoned settlements or fashion crude kettles from whatever metal they could find. Sometimes they'd even use large conch shells as makeshift boiling vessels. The process was rough around the edges. Seawater bubbled violently over these chaotic fires, sending steam clouds across temporary camps that looked more like shipwreck graveyards than salt operations. But here's where things got interesting and messy. Unlike the clean salt from proper facilities, this driftwood method produced something extra. The salt came out mixed with bitter minerals called bittern, creating a sludgy mess that would make any respectable salt merchant cringe. But pirates weren't running a fancy operation here. They needed salt, and they needed it fast. The trick was separating the good from the bad. As the seawater boiled down, pirates learned to scrape out the white crystals that formed on top while the fire was still burning. Quick hands meant cleaner salt. Wait too long, and everything mixed together into a bitter, almost inedible paste. Then came the draining game. Pirates would poke holes in their makeshift containers or tip them slightly to let the nasty bitter liquid run off. What remained was rough, slightly gray salt that tasted decent enough to preserve meat and fish. Not perfect, but it beat starving on a deserted island. This whole driftwood operation could run for days, with pirates feeding broken ship parts into fires that never seemed to go out. Smoke signals probably announced their presence to anyone within miles, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The irony wasn't lost on them, using the remains of someone else's maritime disaster to create something essential for their own survival. The salt they produced this way had character, you could say. Gritty, slightly smoky, and definitely not what you'd find in a merchant's premium stock. But it worked. However, smart pirates knew this was just the beginning. The real challenge was turning this rough product into something worth keeping. And that's where some truly clever tricks came into play. When pirates ended up with salt mixed with bitter minerals called bittern, they didn't just throw it away like amateurs. They had a clever trick that sounds almost like magic, but makes perfect sense once you understand the science behind it. The method involves setting up wooden troughs and sticking upright wooden sticks right into the middle of them. Then they'd pour their messy, bitter brine mixture into these contraptions and wait. The salt would start crystallizing directly onto those wooden sticks, creating what pirates called salt cats. Weird name, right? Nobody knows exactly why they called them that, but the process worked like a charm. These salt cats could grow surprisingly large. Sometimes they weighed as much as the regular salt harvest itself, which meant pirates could basically double their haul from the same batch of seawater. The wooden sticks acted like magnets for the pure salt crystals, while the nasty bittern liquid stayed at the bottom of the trough. But here's where it gets interesting. The bittern wasn't completely useless. Some pirates saved it for later batches or even used it as a crude antiseptic for wounds. Others just dumped it overboard, but the smart ones knew that leftover bittern could be boiled down again if they were desperate for more salt. The beauty of this method was its simplicity. Pirates could make these salt cat contraptions anywhere they had access to wood and basic tools. No fancy equipment needed, just rough wooden troughs and sturdy sticks. The process took patience, though, sometimes several days depending on the weather and how thick the brine was to begin with. What made salt cats especially valuable was their purity. Since the bitter mineral stayed in the liquid below, the salt that formed on the sticks was much cleaner than what you'd get from simple boiling. This meant it lasted longer in storage and tasted better when used for preserving meat or fish. The whole setup looked pretty strange to outsiders, Imagine stumbling across a pirate camp with dozens of wooden sticks poking up from troughs, covered in white crystals like some kind of bizarre forest. But those salt cats represented serious money and survival insurance for any crew smart enough to use the technique. Once pirates had their salt cats ready and their regular salt dried, they faced a new challenge. All that precious white gold needed proper storage to stay valuable, and that meant building secure, weatherproof containers that could keep their treasure safe from both nature and other pirates. Making salt was one thing, but keeping it safe? That's where pirates got really clever. After spending days or weeks boiling seawater and scraping crystals, the last thing any crew wanted was to lose their precious white gold to rain, rats, or rival pirates. Smart captains built what they called cribs, wooden storage boxes lined with planks and fitted with small drainage holes near the bottom. These weren't your average treasure chests. Cribs were specifically designed to let any leftover brine drip out while keeping the salt crystals dry and ready for transport. The drainage system was genius, really. Fresh salt always carried some moisture, and without proper draining, you'd end up with a soggy, unusable mess that wouldn't preserve anything. Pirates often buried these cribs or hid them in caves on remote islands. Why? Well, salt was heavily taxed in most colonial ports. A ship rolling into Nassau or a Port Royal with holds full of untaxed salt could face serious trouble with authorities. But hidden stores, those stayed off the books completely. The location of these secret salt cribs became closely guarded information. Crews would mark hiding spots using coded maps or natural landmarks only they could recognize. A distinctive rock formation here, a bent palm tree there, anything that wouldn't change with the seasons but would guide them back to their stash. Then there's the security aspect. Pirates didn't just worry about colonial tax collectors. Other pirate crews were always looking for easy scores, and a well-stocked salt crib was like finding free money. Some crews stationed guards or rigged crude alarm systems using ropes and bells to protect their investments. The really successful pirates treated their salt stores like modern-day safety deposit boxes. They'd spread their harvest across multiple locations, never keeping everything in one place. Lose one crib to storms or thieves, and you still had backup supplies scattered around the Caribbean. What made this system particularly effective was timing. Pirates could harvest salt during calm weather, store it properly, then return months later when they needed to restock for long voyages or had buyers lined up. The cribs kept their product fresh and market ready. But here's where it gets interesting. Some pirates became so good at this storage game that they started operating like early salt merchants, building networks of hidden cribs across multiple islands. These weren't just random hiding spots anymore. They were becoming the foundation of something much bigger in the Caribbean trade world. The Caribbean wasn't just about buried treasure and sword fights. Some islands became salt-making gold mines that pirates couldn't ignore. Places like Tortuga, the Bahamas, and smaller forgotten dots on the map had natural salt ponds that did most of the work for them. Nature had already scooped out shallow basins where seawater could sit and bake under that relentless tropical sun. Here's where things get interesting. Pirates didn't always raid these islands. Sometimes they became business partners. Ship captains would drop off crews for 3 or 4 months at a time, basically turning them into temporary salt miners. These weren't quick weekend jobs either. The men lived in rough camps, tending the ponds like strange farmers waiting for their crystal crops to grow. But why go through all this trouble? Well, by the late 1600s, Caribbean salt had become more valuable than sugar in many ports. That's right, more than sugar. Think about it. Sugar was a luxury, but salt kept your crew from dying of scurvy and your meat from rotting into green mush. Every ship needed it, which meant every ship would pay for it. The smart pirates figured out they could use salt as currency. Need fresh water and supplies in Port Royal? Trade some salt. Want the local blacksmith to fix your cannons without asking questions? Salt worked better than Spanish coins sometimes. It was like carrying around edible money that everyone actually wanted. Then there's the volume game these pirates played. A single ship's hold packed with quality Caribbean salt could feed a crew for months while leaving plenty left over to trade. Some pirate crews made more money from their salt operations than from actual piracy. Makes sense, right? Less risk of getting shot at, and the profit margins were incredible. The really clever ones set up networks across multiple islands. They'd leave trusted crew members behind to keep the salt production running while the main ship continued raiding or trading elsewhere. When they circled back months later, they'd find tons of pure white salt crystals waiting for them. And the weird part is how this changed pirate culture entirely. Suddenly, you had these rough sea criminals learning about evaporation rates and crystal formation. They became inadvertent experts in chemistry and weather patterns, all because they realized salt could make them richer than gold. For pirates smart enough to master Caribbean salt production, those sun-baked islands became their most reliable treasure chests, ones that refilled themselves every single season.